This video was brought to you by Too Long. That's the official TLDR newspaper that we've made and which is available to order right now. Since Israel's bombardment and invasion of Gaza, more than 100 United Nations aid workers have been killed, the highest number in a single conflict in UN history. Addressing these concerns on November 10th, Israel's representative to the UN claimed in a stunning speech that many UN aid workers in Gaza were actually members of Hamas and attacked the UN as libelous.
I will remind the Council that Hamas, a genocidal terror organization, controls every facet of Gaza. Every number from the so-called Ministry of Health is Hamas. Many UNRWA workers in Gaza are themselves members of Hamas. The time has come to bust the myth of UN-supplied facts.
And this was neither the first nor the last time that Israel would attack the UN. In the immediate aftermath of October 7th, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres condemned the attacks, but noted that they didn't happen in a vacuum, prompting Israel's representative to accuse him of blood libel and demand his resignation. In fact, as recently as Sunday, an Israeli government spokesperson said that the World Health Organization was covering up Hamas's use of hospitals as human shields, and that therefore it was complicit with any loss of life. Now, the fact that Israel feels confident making these accusations, and the fact that it's faced basically no repercussions for doing so, is a symptom of a wider issue: the UN's declining relevance. And the UN has looked especially impotent recently. General Assembly resolutions calling for a humanitarian truce in Gaza and reaffirming the illegality of Israeli settlements have had no impact on Israeli policy, and it took the UN Security Council over a month to even agree to a resolution calling for an extended humanitarian pause in Gaza, only for it to be essentially ignored. Tellingly, only one leader out of the 5 permanent Security Council members, US President Joe Biden, actually turned up to the UN's annual meeting. And the UN looked similarly impotent when it came to Ukraine. Numerous resolutions criticizing the invasion and demanding its end have had no impact, and Russia's removal from the Human Rights Council barely even hit the headlines. And even the UN now recognizes its own impotence. Last month, Guterres admitted that geopolitical diversions are undermining the UN's capability to respond, and that the UN needed to reform. But while it's been most acutely challenged by Ukraine and Gaza, the UN's relevance has arguably been declining for at least the last couple of decades. So in this video, we're going to explain this decline, why it's probably a bad thing, and how reform could reverse this trend. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, the first thing to say is that it's easy to overstate the case here. The UN has always had issues, and despite that, it does some great work. It's still the last best hope for crisis-struck states. It produces some of the best international research available, and many of its peacekeeping missions have been impressively successful, even if they don't hit the headlines as much as the ones that fail. And today, in most countries, apart from Japan and Israel, most people have a positive opinion of the UN. Nevertheless, the UN does seem increasingly irrelevant, and politicians have become more explicitly critical of it. So, when did this happen? Well, as we see it, the UN's recent decline began with Iraq. Those in favour of the war were furious that after a decade of Security Council resolutions, including the Last Chance Resolution 1441, the UN couldn't agree on action, and took Iraq as proof that the UN was being unnecessarily bureaucratic to be circumvented. Anti-war advocates were similarly furious that the UN failed to stop the war, despite the fact that it was, in the words of then Secretary-General Kofi Annan, illegal. After Iraq, other states became more willing to ignore or undermine the UN, because, as they saw it, if the US was going to ignore the UN, then why should they play by the rules? Here, they had at least half a point. The Bush administration was avowedly unilateralist and often dismissed institutions as unnecessary constraints on US power. Other countries also complained that the US single-handedly vetoed otherwise popular resolutions, especially over Israel. The then Deputy Secretary General Mark Malloch Brown warned about this in 2006, predicting serious consequences if the US continued to engage only fitfully with the UN. This was particularly true for Russia, which began more actively wielding its Security Council veto, especially after the Syrian war in 2011 and then Putin's invasion of Ukraine last year. The UN did enjoy a brief resurgence under Obama, who got the Security Council to endorse the Iran nuclear deal and negotiated both the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. But this changed back again under Trump, who was probably the most unilateralist US president in modern history. Nonetheless, while Iran might have been the proximate cause, the UN's decline has been sustained by more structural problems. Firstly, the UN's underfunded. The UN's annual operating budget, funded by member contributions, is only about $3 billion. And the UN's peacekeeping budget isn't much bigger, coming in at about $6.5 billion. And frankly, this is a tiny amount of money. It means that the UN is supporting 12 peacekeeping operations, including 40,000 troops, protecting over 100 million people on a budget roughly the size of the New York City Police Department. At the same time, UN peacekeeping responsibilities have steadily been increasing. In 1999, Kofi Annan expanded its remit to license humanitarian interventions, and in 2013, the UN started using its military compounds to protect refugees, with the first instance of this being in South Sudan. The second big trend for the UN is a trend towards multipolarity. Essentially, as American hegemony wanes and geopolitical fragmentation accelerates, multilateral agreement becomes increasingly difficult. You saw something similar during the peak of the Cold War, when the Soviets and Americans consistently vetoed each other's resolutions. In this sense, the UN's perceived weakness only mirrors the state of the international community, and so perhaps it's unfair to blame the UN as much as we sometimes do. The third big issue for the UN is climate change. Organising an international response to the climate crisis has emerged as one of the UN's primary responsibilities, but they've only been moderately successful in this respect. Developing countries often criticise developed countries for failing to stick to their UN climate promises, including the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. And the UN's apparent inability to enforce these goals is one of the reasons that many in the Global South distrust the UN. But, well, to be fair to the UN here, climate change is probably the most difficult political problem of our time, and getting rich countries to give their money to poor countries while simultaneously sorting the energy transition at home is immensely difficult. Whatever the cause though, the UN's political relevance is declining, and this is probably a bad thing, for the simple and obvious reason that there is no other forum for globe-spanning international diplomacy. Whether the UN's recent decline is permanent or just another low ebb depends on whether or not another forum develops and takes its place. The UN's decline has created the space for new groupings, including the G20, which was recently expanded to include the African Union and BRICS. But while these new groupings might lack the baggage or bureaucracy of the UN, they're not truly global, and they therefore risk exacerbating rather than resolving international fractures. If you want more from TLDR and want to support our journalism, then consider picking up a copy of our newspaper, Too Long. This is a one-off physical newspaper that we've been working on for the last few months, and which contains 32 pages full of analysis and explainers from the TLDR team on everything from Ukraine and Gaza to the state of the French and German governments or the upcoming elections in the UK, US, and around the world. It's not just us either. We also have a full interview with the creator and journalist Johnny Harris that people who buy the newspaper can also watch via a special QR code. There's also articles from a ton of other creators, including JJ McCullough, Search Party, Sophia Smith-Gala, and many more. This has been a really exciting project for us to work on, and hopefully you can already see the work that we've put into it, even into a TLDR-themed crossword. So if you want to pick up a copy and want to fund our journalism on YouTube as we head into 2024, then the link to the store is in the description. Plus, you can get 20% off your purchase this week only by using the code TLDRGLOBAL at checkout. And with a limited quantity available, if you do want one, I'd order one soon, especially if you want it before Christmas. As always, thank you so much for your support, and I hope you like this silly but genuinely good project as much as we do. Thank you.